Aloha from Hawaii. I've been thinking about the Xbox One reveal. What do you think might have happened if Microsoft had not bombed that announcement? Could Xbox have stayed more competitive with PlayStation instead of all the slipping behind with the Xbox One and now the series consoles? It's kind of wild looking back. So many people were upset about the always online requirements and the idea of restricting used games, yet just a few years into that generation, online only games became pretty common, and now most games are sold digitally anyway. Did Microsoft just pitch the future too early and too poorly? Love the show. Keep up the great work. Oliver, I think we've thought about this a lot as well, because it's very obvious that Microsoft's fortunes changed around the Xbox One. But at least from my perspective, and I'm curious to see what you have to think, while that sort of DRM announcement thing certainly had a negative impact on them, I'm not sure it would have drastically altered their fortunes. One, Sony had a very competitive product that would turn out to be a better to develop for machine that was slightly more powerful, and it was tangible in the games that shipped. But two, I feel like Microsoft's woes actually stem from Don Matrick's push towards everything Kinect for a while. And the success of 360 also allowed them to sort of scale back on relying on first party software. They just sort of went, well, we have all these third parties developing for us, so we don't need all these first party studios. So there was this effort to wind down the number of first party studios within the company. And I think that more than anything would have had the same impact on the types of games and the number of games coming out from Microsoft for Xbox during that period, at a time when Sony was actually still firing on all cylinders. But I don't know. What do you think?
I think that, like, fundamentally, Microsoft made a lot of mistakes that generation, and I agree that the DRM issue was one of those mistakes, but, like, fundamentally, it seemed like, in addition to Kinect, the big bet with the Xbox One generation was on, like, apps and services and, like, TV pass-through, interestingly, which even that seemed, like, dated at the time, the TV pass-through. I thought that was, like, even in 2013, was a little bit silly when terrestrial TV was clearly declining. But in the end, Sony managed to match them feature for feature with almost everything that mattered. And that's basically because the PS4 shipped with 8 gigabytes of RAM and the same processor, basically a very similar processor, all that good stuff. So they ended up being able to match a lot of those features. And I feel like that kind of scooped Microsoft. Kinect was also a critical mistake, which increased the bill of materials. But I mean, even absent Kinect, the bill of materials for the Xbox One without a Kinect was still, I mean, from third-party analyses, still pretty similar to a PS4 console. I think because of the additional complexity, the larger die size, there were some issues there possibly with getting that console down to a good level. And that's while having quite a bit of a weaker GPU there, a substantially weaker GPU with only 12 CUs instead of 18 CUs. Obviously much less memory bandwidth with that 8 gigabytes of DDR3 instead of GDDR5. So I think that, like, ultimately with the Don Matrick era, there were a lot of calls that were made with Xbox One that I can even see at the time, in 2011, 2010, 2012, looking at those calls and saying, check, that looks reasonable. Motion control seemed reasonable. DDR3 seemed reasonable. Terrestrial TV seemed reasonable. ESRAM seemed reasonable. But in the end, like, in time, all those calls were just the wrong calls. Like, they made like 5 or 6 key hardware calls that were different from Sony's. Along with a lot of the same ones, obviously, like an AMD APU that was based on GCN and all this other good stuff, right? Jaguar-based CPU. But all the calls they made different from Sony were, like, just the wrong calls. So that was a really tough generation. And that's where I think they went wrong. In the end, those were all just mistakes. And that's really what sunk Microsoft that generation, in my view. It was the kind of cumulative effect of all these problems.
Yep. Alex, anything?
No, I just have to agree that it wasn't only the presentation, which was disastrous in its own right. And then but I really think it was all these combination of factors. I think it's a little bit of a shame, though, because I think still Xbox One had some good games at the end of it.
Sure.
But it just was not nearly as hardware was just. I think it was bad hardware. So yeah.
And all that time spent wasted on Kinect. I'm sorry.
So much.
Oh man.
By the time Kinect hit, like, motion control for 2D games was clearly, like, heading on the way out, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Wii's popularity kind of declined pretty quickly at that point. And I think we didn't know it yet, but motion control would be spun off and be much more useful for VR applications, right? And that's that amazing luck that Sony had with the Move, right? The Move was a cool little piece of kit, but it didn't really do much on the PS3. But that they were able to leverage that and use that with the PSVR some years later. That was, man, I'm surprised that worked out as well as it did. Even though they weren't great for VR, they still worked okay. But the Kinect, on the other hand, it required full dedicated teams to create very specific experiences for it. And I feel like, especially with a company like Rare, like I feel like Kinect stole so many good years from Rare. And really, they could have been doing so many other things, but instead they were railed into doing just like this constant Kinect stuff. Yeah. And that's such a shame, man. And it just created a lot of difficult situations. We ended up with Rise at launch, but that was initially like being developed for Kinect, right?
Yeah, it was Xbox 360 Kinect title.
Remember that?
Codenamed Kingdoms. I remember all that. Yeah.
Man, there's just Kinect was like the worst thing they could have done. It was I hate the Kinect. I really do. I think there's some interesting stuff for it, but I think that was like the big thing, along with those other decisions you mentioned, Oliver, that really contributed to where they are now. But chasing down Kinect was like the biggest red herring in the history of that company anyway. Yeah. And it's the thing that I think really, 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 really hurt Xbox.
The kind of alternative technology suite that Sony had that generation for controller options, I thought was more conservative in some ways, and also better integrated into games. Like you obviously had the gyroscope functionality that ended up being very crucial for PSVR, as well as for a lot of games that, you'd have an additional gyroscope aiming mode possibly that was present in a few games, and it had some uses there. You had the touchpad, which is still feels a little bit vestigial. Maybe that didn't quite pay off, but at least it wasn't something that required a big hardware investment and required raising the cost of the console by $100, right? So those were kind of more conservative bets that ultimately I think paid off much better.
And they had minimal impact on game development, right? Exactly, developers could or could not choose to play with those features, and adding them didn't mean you were like drastically altering everything about your game, which was kind of the case if you were making a real Kinect game versus just adding in voice commands to yell like shoot, Oh my gosh, Kinect.